Welcome to the first annual Frank P. Zeidler Memorial Lecture. Investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill addresses the topic, Global Wars, Private Armies, and Public Money. The lecture was recorded on March 25, 2008, at the Milwaukee Public Library's Centennial Hall. Here is committee member Virginia Schwartz.
It is our great privilege to host the first annual Frank P. Zeidler Memorial Lecture. We ask you to all participate with us in respecting his memory. This is an author presentation. That is all it is. We're having an author this evening who will talk about his book. After he talks, there will be questions. You may write your questions on paper that the ushers will pick up, and we will read the questions from here. After that, he will have a book signing in the loose room. As you leave the auditorium, it'll be to your right, but we'll call you all in order of the place saver that you received. You don't want to hear any more from me. You want to hear the speaker of the evening. We are very pleased to have with us this evening Patrick Nettesheim, who entertained you first, and thank you for that, Patrick. I'll introduce now our speaker. Our speaker is the Master of Ceremonies for the evening. He's the Vice President of the Zeidler Memorial Lecture Committee, Gary Shulman. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you very much, Virginia. And I'd like to thank our principal co-sponsors this evening, the Milwaukee Public Library, which provides this wonderful facility, the Argosy Foundation, which has given us some financial support to make this possible, and we hope future Frank P. Zeidler lectures, and the International Institute of Wisconsin, Alexander Dirtka, has done so much to make us go. You may note that I am not John Nichols. John Nichols came up with a late engagement, and so I'm honored to take his place and to be the moderator this evening. And I'm especially honored because I hold a position in the community that Frank Zeidler held for more than 20 years. I'm president of the Greater Milwaukee United Nations Association chapter. And I invite you all to join as soon as you can. This would not be possible if it weren't for the energy and the ideas of the gentleman on my right, Mr. Philip Blank. Phil Blank put together the Frank P. Zeidler Memorial Lecture Committee, which consists of 15 of the organizations that Frank either led, founded, or certainly supported in various ways. And according to his daughter Anita, that's not all of them. There are more. But it's a good representation. And it's Phil's imagination and energy that put this together, and I'd like to invite Phil to give you a welcome right now.
Thank you. We are here because of anniversaries of Public TV and PEC. Public TV would not be here without Frank Zeidler, and the story of that is a lecture in itself. PEC is the Public Enterprise Committee which Frank Cope founded. I'll be frank, and please know what I mean, this one way: he was nonpareil. Frank P. Zeidler is the greatest Milwaukeean. Long live the memory. Mayor Frank Zeidler, a man of the people then, still resonates now. An elder statesman to which we'd like to aspire, Frank P. Zeidler was. So much to do in so little time. We must plow on for FPZ. We rejoice in the honor of FPZ. He was a force for all. It's an honor to have such a friend and mentor over 40 years. In office, he made the city debt-free. No one could do it again. He grew the city to its present size. Now we should have metro rule. ethnic and neighborhood history, geology, he did it all. Any subject could he master and share it with all who were present. He opposed privatization when the city could do it better. Self-educated mainly, he received many honorary docs. In old age, his brain never faltered. I hope that I can follow suit.
Thank you, Dr. Blank. We have in our audience, I think, a number of aspiring political people, from maybe aldermen to congressmen. But we also have former Mayor Marvin Pratt. And I'd like to invite former Mayor Pratt up here for a brief announcement.
Thank you. I'm reminded of the song, Where Have All the Activists Gone? And they're in Centennial Hall tonight. Okay. You know, I'm just real pleased to be here in recognition of Mayor Zeidler, Frank P. Zeidler. And one of the things I do remember, he never left 2900 block on North 2nd Street. Did he? Okay, that's great. I was honored and privileged to chair the Frank P. Zeidler Public Service Award Selection Committee. Now, I'm the chair. We have others who are here tonight. Attorney Art Heitzer is the vice chair. John Gerda is also on the committee. Shelley Rolling is on the committee, and Alderman Bob Bauman. And the resolution came from the Common Council to create this award, Public Service Award, in honor of Mayor Zeidler, to recognize those of you in this audience who have somewhat dedicated your life and done some things that would make Mayor Zeidler proud. And so it's a one-page nomination form, which you will find out in the back. The award, it will go from, and you can fill out the nomination form from now to June 30th. The award and the selection committee will make the selection around August, and it will be presented to the honorees, either one or two or more, at the September 2nd meeting in the Common Council chambers. Mayor Barrett, Alderman Hines, President of the Council, and all members of the Common Council were supportive of this award. So please think of someone who's deserving of this award in memory of the Honorable Frank P. Zeidler. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Pratt. We appreciate your public service very much. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to go over a little bit of the protocol for the evening. I think Virginia laid it out nicely that we will have his presentation and a question and answer period during it, and then at 9 o'clock we will adjourn, and Jeremy will have a book signing, and our political candidates can work the room at that point. I'd like to thank the Vets Place Central for doing a great job ushering. Thank you so much, guys. And I guess the last bit of business, in your programs there are question cards. And if you do have something you want to get into the mix, would you fill out the card with a question and then hand it up so the ushers can bring them up to me, and then we will, I'll read them off. And there's a reason for that, which you all know, is that it will move much more quickly. We'll get in more questions that way than having everybody taking over the mic. When the committee first started meeting, we decided to have the program tonight focus on privatization. And as it turns out, we couldn't have a better person than Milwaukee native Jeremy Scahill to address that topic. He's a graduate of Wauwatosa East High School. He's attended both UWM and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and went out into the world and has really made quite a name for himself. I think we can be very proud. You've seen him on Bill Moyers, you've heard him with Terry Gross, and now his book, Blackwater USA, made the New York Times bestseller list. I know Jeremy's out here. Oh, there he is. And we're very proud to invite him back to Milwaukee and to have you engage in what I think folks who've done the marching, it will be a rally for peace as well. Thank you.
In the interest of full disclosure, I had to dig in my dad's closet today to find a tie. That's not a joke. It's a tremendous, tremendous honor, not only to be here in Milwaukee, but to be here to honor the legacy, the life, the work, the struggle of Mayor Frank Zeidler, a true American patriot, a true American hero. You know, I wrote this book about a private contractor, as they're called. It sounds like they're engaged in construction or water purification projects, called Blackwater. And I'm going to talk about Blackwater in a moment, but I wanted to say something at the onset about the legacy of Frank Zeidler. And I said it this morning on the radio here in Wisconsin. I think that the struggle that Frank Zeidler waged produced a model that was the antithesis of everything that Blackwater stands for and represents in this country and around the world. And it was a response decades ago to a trend that now is in full swing in this country, and that is the most radical privatization agenda in the history of our country. I would like to thank Phil Blank, the Zeidler family, Gary Shellman. I'd like to thank the Milwaukee Public Library, the key word there being public. I'd also like to thank Mayor Pratt for being here this evening and for doing the work that you're doing and honoring the legacy of Frank Zeidler as well. I'd also like to thank my friends from Peace Action, who I think just came from a demonstration, the 4,000th demonstration that they've engaged in. I also would like to thank Art Heitzer and the Milwaukee Coalition to Normalize Relations with Cuba, who've been doing very important work for many, many years here in Milwaukee. I am going to talk later on this evening a little bit more about Frank Zeidler, but I wanted to step back a little bit and look at some of the more recent events and recent struggles. I just came a couple of weeks ago from a historic event in Washington, D.C. That was systematically and completely ignored by the establishment corporate media in this country. Some of you may not even have been aware that it took place. It was called the Winter Soldier hearings. And this was a gathering of over 250 veterans of the United States Armed Forces who have served since 9/11. Many of them had been on the front lines of Iraq and Afghanistan. And they gathered together in Washington, D.C., like veterans of the Vietnam War did in the early 1970s, to provide groundbreaking and important public testimony on what they had seen, what they had done, what they had witnessed, what they had participated in the wars and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. The New York Times didn't cover it. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel didn't cover it. The Washington Post did cover it, but they covered it in the Metro section of the paper as though it was a local story that 250 veterans had come together. Over 40 of them testified. Some of them talked about their role in shooting Iraqi civilians, in being guards at Guantanamo, in choking people, civilians, and throwing feces disguised as food rations at Iraqi children on the side of the road, at being a part of actions that I think could in a very liberal way be described as war crimes. And these brave young people, many of them never voted before in an election in their life, Their main concern isn't who wins the Democratic nomination. It's not who wins the election in November. Their main concern is bringing a swift end to the occupation of Iraq. And they know how to do it. These young people cannot be dismissed like some peace activists are by the political campaigns as being naive, because they've returned from the front lines. And what they're saying is clear: immediate unconditional withdrawal of all US troops and contractors from Iraq, and reparations payments to begin immediately to the Iraqi people. That call is coming from an organization called Iraq Veterans Against the War, IVAW. They have over 800 members, some of whom are active duty US soldiers on the ground in Iraq right now. And the organizers of IVAW told me the other day that after the Winter Soldier hearings were broadcast on the internet, that they began receiving email after email from active duty soldiers in Iraq saying, "We want to join your organization." The fact that the corporate media is ignoring this, the fact that MoveOn.org has refused to alert its 3.3 million members that this hearing took place is an abomination. And I want to say that there's a handful of veterans in the room tonight who are members of IVAW. Jacob Flom, who's from here in Milwaukee, is one of the members of the IVAW chapter. And I would encourage you to support these veterans on a local level here and to get involved with what they're doing, because these are real leaders at a time when we so desperately need them. They have the clarity to see the just solution to the occupation of Iraq. This isn't partisan politics. This is life or death politics. And I'll end this part of what I'm saying by saying this, that among the people who testified at these hearings were people who've never given a public speech in their life, and the bravery that they showed in getting up and not giving a speech at speech class, not doing what I'm doing here tonight, but getting up and saying, "This is something that I did, and I'm ashamed for having done it." Or, "This is something I witnessed, and I didn't stop it, and I'm ashamed for having been a part of it," was profound. Profound bravery to tell the truth, especially when it's about your participation in something. That's the kind of courage that we need in dark times like these. And I was so chilled to hear some of what they said, but I was so heartened when veteran after veteran ended their remarks by saying, in closing, "I want to say to the Iraqi people, I'm sorry. Sorry for what I did." Some of them ripped up their commendation letters from General David Petraeus and said, "You're not my general anymore." How dare the media in this country ignore it? On the 5th anniversary of the war, when 4,000 US soldiers have been killed, over 1 million Iraqis have died, over 1,200 so-called private contractors, and it's ignored. And Dick Cheney says, when confronted with the reality that 64% of Americans are against the war, and I think that's a conservative number, so? Dick Cheney says so. When he was told by Martha Raddatz of ABC News 4,000 US soldiers have now died in Iraq, he said they volunteered to put on the uniform. I don't think that the young men and women who signed up to be in the Pennsylvania National Guard to fight floods in their community signed up to go and commit war crimes in Fallujah, Mr. Cheney. I don't think they decided to sign up for the military to be a part of a war that wasn't authorized by any international body, that is against international law, that is against the will of over 70% of the Iraqis and over 64% of the American people. I don't think they volunteered for that, Mr. Cheney. I want to begin my more focused talk tonight about privatization, private armies, global wars, by telling you a story that you may be familiar with. I'm sure many of you have heard some of the details of it, but I've been doing an investigation of this incident that I'm going to describe since last September. And it began on the afternoon of September 16th in a neighborhood of Baghdad that I knew well, called Mansour. And it happened in an intersection called Nisr Square. A little bit after noon, local time in Baghdad, 100-degree heat, a young Iraqi medical student named Haitham al-Rubai was driving his mother, Mahassan. She herself was a doctor. They were driving through this square in Baghdad. They had just dropped off Haytham's father, Jawad, who also was a doctor. It was a family of medical people that had determined not to leave Iraq. They had the means to do it, but they said that the fact that so many doctors were fleeing saddened them so deeply that they decided to stay, and their son was remaining as a medical student in war-torn Iraq. And that day, they had just dropped off Dr. Jawad at the hospital where he worked. They were on their way to drop off college applications for his sister, and when they pulled into the square, Iraqi police officers were waving down, trying to stop all of the cars, because as has become so custom in Iraq, a convoy of American vehicles was whizzing through on the wrong side of the street. They were driving armored Mamba South African armored personnel carriers mounted with heavy weapons on them, and they were barreling through the streets, and the Iraqi police officers were trying to stop traffic, and Haytham al-Rubai's car didn't stop quick enough, and so Haytham al-Rubai took a gunshot to the skull, took him out right away, and as his head poured blood, his mother grabbed his body and held her son in that vehicle, and Iraqi policemen ran to the scene to try to respond to it. And when they got there, they said they were trying to pull her out of the vehicle because they were afraid that the gunners were going to keep shooting at them, and they wanted to remove her from the scene, but she wouldn't let go of her son's dying body. And the Iraqi police officers saw men from the armored vehicles pointing their guns at that car being driven by these civilians. The driver had just been shot in the head, the mother holding her son. And they put up their hands, and they didn't have their weapons, and they were yelling at them to not shoot, and they realized that they were going to fire on the car, and so the police officers ran, and then the car was lit up with bullets, and some kind of a projectile was launched at it, and the vehicle exploded, and the mother's body was burned into one with her son in that vehicle. That incident would set up a 15-minute killing spree, during which 17 Iraqi civilians were gunned down in the streets of Baghdad that day. Over 20 civilians were wounded. Among the dead were children as young as 9 years old. The father of one of the victims, a 9-year-old named Ali, his son's heart was still beating, but his skull had been fractured by a bullet, and he ran him to the hospital and tried to get the doctors to save his son's life, and they couldn't. And this was a devoutly religious Shiite Muslim. And he returned to the scene the next day to gather up the pieces of his son's shattered skull so that he could take his entire body to be buried in the holy city of Najaf. The Iraqi government responded to these killings because it wasn't Iraqi insurgents that had done the firing that day. It wasn't US soldiers that had done the firing that day. It was private soldiers working for a secretive mercenary company based in the wilderness of North Carolina. Its name is Blackwater. Those were the shooters that day in Baghdad's Nisr Square. The Iraqi government responded and said that Blackwater has to leave our country. They're no longer welcome here. We're going to revoke their operating license. Point of fact, Blackwater hadn't even had an operating license at that point in Iraq. But the reality was that what the Iraqis learned that day is that Nouri al-Maliki is not the prime minister of Iraq, Condoleezza Rice is. Because when Nouri al-Maliki said they have to leave and the Iraqi judicial officials said we're going to put the shooters on trial in our courts, the Riot Act was read to them by the White House. In fact, the Bush administration had to remind the Iraqi government that you can't prosecute Americans in your courts. You see, Paul Bremer, the original head of the US occupation after James Garner spent a couple of weeks there, when Paul Bremer skulked out of Baghdad in June of 2004, he had spent a year in Iraq being guarded by Blackwater, and as he departed that country, he issued an edict known as Order 17, which granted sweeping immunity to all contractors under Iraqi law. That meant that at a time when the US said it was handing over sovereignty to the Iraqis, it was actually defanging the country's legal system, the country's judicial system. It was a strange definition of sovereignty. For 3 days after this killing spree took place, Blackwater convoys didn't move at all around Iraq. They stayed inside of the green zone. So central had they become to the US occupation that not a single US official could go outside of the green zone because they didn't have their Blackwater mercenaries to protect them. An Iraqi friend of mine said they turned the green zone into the green zoo. Couldn't go anywhere. What happened after these killings was that the Iraqi government did an investigation. They took evidence from the crime scene. They interviewed witnesses. They tried to talk to the Blackwater shooters, but Blackwater wouldn't make them available, nor would the State Department. And they determined that the Iraqis killed that day had all been killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked shooting on the part of the American operatives working for Blackwater. Back in the United States, what was happening in Washington at the highest levels of power is that a cover-up of these killings was underway. An attempt to immunize the shooters, the killers, from any form of prosecution was underway, and it emanated directly from the White House. In the words of one U.S. official, the State Department circled the wagons to protect Blackwater. And so what happened after these killings took place is that we heard in the media about how the Iraqi Interior Ministry is a hotbed of sectarianism run by Muqtada al-Sadr, and they have an agenda against the United States, and they're not telling the truth about Blackwater. For 2 full weeks after these killings took place, the United States government didn't investigate the incident except for the State Department, which relies on Blackwater for its protection in Iraq. And so the very people whose lives literally were in the hands of Blackwater were the ones investigating Blackwater in Iraq. And so what they did is they sat down with the alleged shooters that day, the State Department investigators did, and they offered them what's called limited use immunity in exchange for their statements. If you and I were alleged to have killed 17 civilians, at a minimum we would be read our Miranda rights, meaning that we have the right to remain silent. Anything we say can and will be used against us in a court of law. What these individuals were told by the State Department was this: nothing you say can or will be used against you in a court of law. Literally, those were the statements that they signed. And in return for signing those statements, getting them to sign those statements, the State Department got their version of events. And so the first blush report was leaked to the media from the State Department. And it said that Blackwater had been the victim of a hostile attack from armed Iraqi enemies. That's what Blackwater said. That's what the State Department said. Now, Blackwater saying it is one thing, but the State Department saying it is another thing. But then we dig a little deeper and we learn that, in fact, the State Department's report was written by a Blackwater contractor on official letterhead of the U.S. State Department. His name was Darren Hanner. He wrote the report on State Department stationery. So for 2 weeks, this is how the investigation went down. The Iraqis are a bunch of Muqtada al-Sadr followers who aren't going to tell the truth. Blackwater is saying it was armed insurgents who attacked us. The State Department is concurring with Blackwater, and so then finally, under pressure, the Bush administration gets around to sending the top law enforcement agency of the United States government over to investigate the FBI. And it turns out that when the FBI was preparing to go over there, the security detail that was going to be assigned to protect them on the investigation was going to be provided by Blackwater. That wasn't until Senator Patrick Leahy raised questions about it, and then the FBI backed off and said, okay, we're going to have our investigators protected by US government personnel. So the FBI goes over there and they begin their investigation. Well, something that the Bush administration didn't take into account in this incident was the fact that there was another player involved who arrived on the scene 10 or 15 minutes after the shootings took place that did an investigation. And unlike the Iraqi Interior Ministry, it couldn't be dismissed so lightly. It was the US military. The US military arrived on the scene. It interviewed witnesses, took photos of the crime scene, talked to Iraqi police, talked to some of the shooters. The military determined that all 17, this is the US military, that all 17 of the Iraqi civilians killed that day were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked firing, and they said there was evidence of criminal conduct at play there. That story went nowhere in the US media whatsoever. Blackwater's owner, Eric Prince, said, that's just the opinion of one colonel. I don't even know if he has experience in crime scene investigations. But then something interesting happened. The FBI's investigation, part of it was leaked to the New York Times. The FBI found that 14 of the 17 Iraqis killed that day were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked shooting. One military official told the Times that the FBI was being too generous to Blackwater. And the reason I get into this entire story for you is because this is not an unusual occurrence. Yes, this was the largest massacre of Iraqi civilians that we have been able to document to date carried out by private forces working on the US government payroll in Iraq. But the story that I just told you now has been policy of the Bush administration for all 5 years of this occupation. It is why there are an equal number of contractors, as they're called in Iraq right now, to US soldiers. In fact, there may even be more private contractors now. Current troop levels are at about 150, 160,000. Contractor levels fluctuate between 140 and 180,000. That means the US military is now the junior partner in the coalition that's occupying Iraq. 64 US soldiers have been court-martialed on murder-related charges alone in Iraq. Not a single armed contractor has ever been charged or prosecuted for any crimes committed against an Iraqi. Never. So either you have tens of thousands of Boy Scouts working as private contractors in Iraq, or something is fundamentally criminal about the system at play there. There were 2 prosecutions of private contractors in Iraq since the beginning. Neither of them were armed contractors. One was a former KBR employee alleged to have stabbed a coworker in a kitchen. The other was a contractor who pled guilty to the possession of child pornography images on his computer at Abu Ghraib prison. What about the pornography of torture committed by private contractors at Abu Ghraib prison? And so now we have a situation where 17 Iraqi civilians have been killed. The Iraqi government is outraged, tried to expel them. The US says you can't prosecute them in your courts. They haven't been indicted in US courts. They haven't been court-martialed in the military court-martial system. And this is the reality, the state of so-called oversight of the business of war in the United States. What the US government has done is, behind the scenes, when these incidents take place, they try to facilitate the payment of hush money to Iraqi victims. That's what happened after a Blackwater operative shot and killed the bodyguard to the Iraqi vice president. Blackwater, within 36 hours, snuck him out of the country. He then was back in the Middle East a few weeks later working for another company. He's never been indicted. Can you imagine if an Iraqi killed a Vice President Dick Cheney bodyguard? What would happen to that individual? And so the Iraqi puppet government in Iraq still has been pushing hard on this issue, and it has gone absolutely nowhere. Blackwater just surpassed $1 billion in contracts just for its Iraq security work. And Blackwater is actually one of the smaller operations making a killing off of this war. There are 630 corporations on the US government payroll in Iraq right now. They have personnel drawn from 100 countries around the world. Many of the home governments of those individuals are actually opposed to the war in Iraq and oppose the invasion from the beginning. And so this has been a way of doing a number of things. It subverts the democratic process in this country because most Americans are opposed to this war right now. Most nations in the world are opposed to this war. The Bush administration doesn't want to have to implement a draft because it could make the war politically untenable. And when you can't get nation states to join up with your little adventure to invade and occupy other countries, you turn around and you rent an army, which is effectively what the Bush administration has done. They have rented an army to deploy in Iraq. The death count of the individuals who work for these companies doesn't get counted in the official death toll, so it masks the human cost of the occupation in terms of American lives, certainly, but also their injuries don't get counted. Over 1,200 families of contractors killed in Iraq have applied for federal death benefits through the US Department of Labor. Over 13,000 have applied for injury benefits through the US Department of Labor, and those are just the ones that are eligible for federal benefits. So yes, it masks the cost of the occupation, but there's also something more insidious at play here. Many people believe that the point of the Iraq War was to take Iraq's oil, and I think that's a very important discussion. But that's not what I want to focus on tonight, because I think there's something that seldom gets discussed, and that's this. It wasn't just about looting Iraq. It was about looting the US Treasury as well. War is business, and business has been very, very good over the past 5 years in this country because of the Iraq occupation. You know, Blackwater is up for its contract renewal in Iraq in May. It very well may leave Iraq. It very well may stay in Iraq. I don't know. I have no way of calling it. But I do know this. Blackwater's already gotten what it needed from Iraq. You see, if Blackwater was selling spinach, and that spinach went out to grocery stores and it was contaminated and it made people sick, there'd be a huge outcry. People wouldn't want to go anywhere near Blackwater spinach. But Blackwater's product is not food. Blackwater's product is executive armed protection. And you know what the Republicans in the Congress say when Henry Waxman holds hearings on Blackwater? They say the number that's important when we talk about Blackwater is not the money, it's not the Iraqi lives, it's the number 0, which is the number of Americans under Blackwater's protection who've been killed in Iraq. That's how cynical it's become. So Blackwater has secured a reputation that they will keep alive their client. They call them the noun, the person, place, or thing that they guard. They will keep alive their noun at any cost. If it means we're going to shoot up 17 Iraqis, wound 20 others, enrage Iraqis all across that country, that's okay, because our guy was kept alive that day. And this is all being done. Don't think it's just, well, this is mercenary armies operating on their own. The Iraqis don't see it that way. It's all the occupation. It's all the Americans. That's why we see a growing chorus of voices coming from within the military. And I'm not talking about the young men and women who are Winter Soldier. I'm talking from military commanders who are saying that Blackwater is hurting the U.S. counterinsurgency effort in Iraq. Do you know what Robert Gates, the defense secretary, made a statement late last year? He said that the work of these contractors is at cross purposes with the U.S. mission in Iraq. Now, I don't agree with the U.S. mission in Iraq as defined by Robert Gates, but for Bush's defense secretary to say that, that should be an indication this isn't a partisan issue. It shouldn't be viewed as such. This is that crimes are being committed in the names of the people of this country, and they, you know what? For supporters of the military, they are degrading the reputation of the U.S. military with their crimes, because what they are doing is committing acts that cause blowback on official U.S. forces in Iraq and ultimately stain further the image of the people of the United States of America. And so now we have an election that I think many people feel a number of things about. I think a lot of people feel that we're at a moment of great hope where we have candidates that are actually speaking in a language and about issues that in the lives of a lot of young people certainly has not been the dominant politics in this country. I think we've seen a tremendous level of energy on this campaign. And I want to say something that may be a tough pill here tonight, but I want to put it out there because I think it is a life or death issue. Many of my best and closest friends are in love with Barack Obama right now. And I've been having an ongoing discussion with them about this, and this is what I can share with you. I'm not trying to break up anybody's love affair with Barack Obama. I want to get people to cheat on him with a little bit of conscience on the war. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, neither of them has any serious plan to end the U.S. occupation of Iraq. That's not my opinion, that's a fact. If you read Barack Obama's Iraq plan, and you read Senator Hillary Clinton's Iraq plan, they both have plans that are largely based on the 2007 Defense Supplemental, which was portrayed as the Democrats' withdrawal plan, as well as on the findings of the Iraq Study Group. They have plans that will keep in place for an indefinite period of time with no end date, a force of at least 20 to 80,000 US troops. On top of that, they'll be required to keep an equal number of contractors. Senator Barack Obama's senior foreign policy advisor told me that Senator Obama will not rule out the use of Blackwater and other private military companies. Senator Hillary Clinton, in an act of extraordinary political opportunism, the day after I published that story, became the single most important US political leader to call for a ban on Blackwater. I can't take it seriously because for 5 years, Hillary Clinton was on the Armed Services Committee and was missing in both action and words about Blackwater and the mercenary industry. But I do think that Barack Obama should join her because Obama has been way ahead of her on this issue. But the reality is this: let's not have any illusions about who these people are when it comes to the war. They're going to keep the green zone in place. They're going to keep a US embassy that was built on slave labor, the largest ever of any country in the history of the world. They're going to keep, in the words of Barack Obama's plan, a strike force in place to strike at Al-Qaeda, using constantly the vocabulary of the Bush administration to describe the resistance on the ground in Iraq. And so the reason that I bring this up tonight is because I think a lot of people have tremendous energy and enthusiasm right now. And I think that if you're a supporter of either Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, Now is your time for action. Not after somebody's coronated, not after the Democratic National Convention. Now. Because right now is when they actually do need you. They need your support. They need your money. They need your votes. They need you to be out there with your buttons on for them, supporting them. I'm not telling you not to do that. I'm saying that it's even better if you are a supporter of one of those individuals, you have given them money, you did vote for them, write a letter to them and say, we want a better plan on Iraq because this is not acceptable. We want you to listen to the Iraq veterans against the war. We want you to take seriously the fact that 64% of Americans want it over. They can't be allowed to do what Dick Cheney does and say so. Now is our opportunity to challenge them. And we need to have the temerity to do that right now. Because once we choose sides in that way, and we fall in sync and we start defending policies that we disagree with, we become cheerleaders. And there's not much to cheer when it comes to their Iraq policies. And so, I'll stop with that part of what I'm saying, but I having spent a tremendous amount of time in Iraq, I feel like I would be remiss to my own conscience not to say that, because I think the stakes are much too high for US soldiers and for Iraqi civilians to let it pass and say we'll figure it all out once the Republicans are evicted from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. John Kerry showed us what happens when you try to run to the right. The next thing I want to say is this. If Blackwater leaves Iraq, if these private companies start to leave Iraq after the November election or in January, which I think is highly unlikely, we have a situation right now developing where these companies have gotten what they needed from Iraq. They have billions of dollars in taxpayer monies that they have used over the past 7 years to build up their infrastructure. And what companies like Blackwater have done is to build up parallel infrastructures to the US national security apparatus. Blackwater's new projects include the following. They recently started a private intelligence company called Total Intelligence Solutions. It markets itself as offering CIA-type services, this is in the company literature, to Fortune 500 companies. They're offering to bring the careers of CIA operatives into the corporate boardrooms to do for them what they've done for the US government. This company, which is owned by Blackwater's owner, Eric Prince, is headed by a man named Cofer Black, who's a 30-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, the man who was running the counterterrorist center at the time of 9/11, who told President Bush he was going to chop off Osama bin Laden's head with a machete and have it sent to the president in a box on dry ice. His nickname in the administration was the flies on the eyeball guys, because that's what he said that he and his men were going to do to the Taliban in Afghanistan. But that's rhetoric. What he really did was he was the head of the CIA's Extraordinary Rendition Program, the government-sanctioned kidnap and torture program. He's now running Eric Prince's private little CIA called Total Intelligence Solutions. The number 2 man on that operation is Robert Richer, the former deputy director of operations at the Central Intelligence Agency, also a 30-year veteran of the CIA, who worked closely with Cofer Black and was the CIA's top liaison with King Abdullah of Jordan. Jordan is now one of their clients. Number 3, Enrique Rick Prado, veteran CIA operative specialist in Latin America, and the list goes on and on. They have people from Defense Intelligence, from the FBI, from Homeland Security, 90 people working for that company. It just started about a year ago. They operate out of Virginia, and they're offering their services to foreign governments and private corporations. Blackwater is currently bidding for a share of a $15 billion contract from the Pentagon to fight the war on drugs. So it could be bye-bye Baghdad, hello Bogota. And as we look at the way that the war on drugs has been used, certainly since the early 1990s, it's been a cover for US counterinsurgency activities in Latin America, a backdoor presence of the US military. The US gives Colombia $630 million a year just under the war on drugs funding. Half of that goes directly to US mercenary companies like DynCorp, which is one of the Walmarts of private security. Those programs are escalating dramatically right now, and there are US mercenary companies operating all throughout Central and Latin America. They're even in Bolivia. Evo Morales allowed DynCorp to come into his country. Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia. This is the next frontier, and if we don't pay attention to it, it's going to hit us one day, because an incident will take place and we'll realize that underneath our noses, billions of dollars of US taxpayer money have gone to build up mercenary armies that are deploying throughout Latin America. The UN Working Group on Mercenaries just issued a report a couple of weeks ago, and they talked about how one of the fastest growing industries in Latin America is security. Security is a very generous term when we talk about what these private companies are engaged in, and we know the devastating role that the School of the Americas has played in training military dictators and human rights abusing forces throughout Latin America. Well, this is sort of a new manifestation of the School of the Americas, and it's one which is even more difficult to oversee, because once you outsource these kinds of operations, training of other militaries, deployments of US personnel in other countries working on corporate contracts that are signed with foreign governments, it becomes almost impossible for the Congress to oversee the work that they're doing. And work is an interesting term, but it appears in their contracts. And so this is a situation now where we have privatization gone wild. We've seen it in Iraq. We see it in intelligence. We have 16 intelligence agencies in the United States. 70% of the budgets, the combined budgets of those agencies, is in the hand of the private sector. Private contractors are involved with the production of the most important US intelligence document produced every day in this country, the Presidential Daily Briefing. When the passport breaches took place, when they dug into Barack Obama's passport 3 times, and John McCain's, and then last year it was Hillary Clinton's. In the case of Barack Obama's, 2 of the individuals who were snooping into his passport records were private contractors working for the US State Department, just like Blackwater's a private contractor working for the US State Department. And we step back from all of this, and I can go on, and I'm not going to do that, but I can go on and on about private intelligence, homeland security, privatization of the Border Patrol, privatization of the war machine in Iraq, privatization of it in Afghanistan. Now they're moving into Latin America. But I want to say something that brings it back here to Milwaukee and to Frank Zeidler, whose legacy we're honoring tonight. We, as I said, are in the midst of the most radical privatization agenda in the history of our country. We're seeing it in our schools, where public education is systematically defunded in the name of school choice, they like to call it. Public education is systematically defunded, and then they say, well, the schools are failing. The schools are failing, and so we need to put them in the hands of the private sector, and Bush pushes his faith-based initiative. And I was here in Milwaukee when Bush got up there and Howard Fuller was clapping away in the audience, and they're talking about the great example here in Milwaukee. Remember Tommy Thompson and welfare reform, and Tommy Thompson and crime, and Bill Clinton took the Tommy Thompson agenda to a national level. Milwaukee has been a laboratory in a lot of ways for these privatization policies on a domestic level. NAFTA has certainly devastated this state as well. And so we see it in the schools. We see it in prisons. I know I don't have to tell people from Wisconsin about the phenomenon of supermaxes that are popping up around the country, and we have corporations now that are running prisons. In fact, we have faith-based prisons now. Blackwater's founder, Eric Prince, gave $200,000 to Chuck Colson. Some of the people older than me in this room probably have an active memory of Chuck Colson. He was the man who authored Nixon's enemies list, his hatchet man, who went to prison for Watergate, the first person. Well, now he's all of a sudden an evangelical minister and an advisor to President Bush, and his prison fellowship runs a private Christian prison in Sugar Land, Texas, in the district of former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. So we see it in prisons. We see it in law enforcement training and in law enforcement as well. We see it in every aspect of our society: public transportation, public parks. I was in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina. I saw people dying of thirst. I walked through the 9th Ward days after the flooding of the city, and you know what I saw that is an image that sticks with me every day of my life? I saw a Circle K, like a 7-Eleven, that had been totally ransacked, as they say in the media, looted. What was taken out of that Circle K? Diapers, food, water, anything you could eat, anything you could drink, anything you could put on your child to keep them from getting a rash. And next to it was a Radio Shack. The window wasn't even broken. Stereos and televisions inside of it. Why? You can't eat a DVD player. You can't drink a television. You can't put an Xbox on your kid's behind. No, But it was food that people were taking. Why were they taking it? Because they'd been systematically neglected and left to die by the federal and state government. And who did I then see patrolling the streets of New Orleans with M4 assault rifles, Glock 9 strapped to their leg, bulletproof vests? Blackwater. They told me when I interviewed them that they were there to confront criminals and stop looters. Well, it turns out they had been hired by the Bush administration under the Department of Homeland Security Federal Protective Service to engage in security operations, and the official language in the contract said that they were there to protect FEMA. I don't know if FEMA has arrived yet in New Orleans, but Blackwater, Blackwater was there on the streets of New Orleans. And you know, I saw people being humiliated in front of their children at these shelters in Baton Rouge. It was, I can't tell you how many African-American residents of that state said to me, this is like the transatlantic slave trade. Because you know what was happening? These right-wing Christian groups were coming up with buses and saying, we'll take you to Missouri and give you a brand new life. They just wanted to get them out. They wanted to de-blackify New Orleans. They wanted to get these people out. And so they parade men in front of their kids, and they strip search them down, and they make them take showers on the street corner in front of the convention center there in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. There was psychological warfare against these people, and they're being chastised for how they use their measly $2,000 debit cards given to them by FEMA that often didn't even work. And Blackwater guys walk around, they tell me they were getting paid $350 a day to be down there, plus a per diem. When I got Blackwater's contracts with the federal government, they billed US taxpayers $950 per man per day. When the Department of Homeland Security did an internal review after we reported this, they determined that it was the best value to the taxpayer. $240,000 a day Blackwater made down there, while poor people were left to die, left to starve, left to be humiliated in front of their children, evicted from their homes which aren't being rebuilt, and the developers are all down there right now, and they're swallowing it all up. New Orleans was a window into what's happening in the lives of working and poor people in this country when disaster hits them. We talk about the home foreclosures and the debt crisis, and that's worth 3 or 4 hours of a discussion, but look at this one small window. When a natural disaster hits, what do rich people do? They don't need to depend on the local fire force. They don't need to depend on the federal government to be rescued. They just call their private security company. Come and rescue us with your helicopter. And that happened all over New Orleans. I met Israeli mercenaries who were patrolling a street outside of a wealthy gated community on Charles Street in New Orleans, and they worked for a company called, and this is not a joke, Instinctive Shooting International. They were flown in by helicopter by a wealthy businessman from Galveston, Texas, to protect his property. I didn't see anybody come anywhere near his property, but I did talk to those Israeli guys, and they said that, you know, the Palestinians, when they see these, aren't afraid of them tapping on their automatic weapons, but you people, when you see them, you get very scared, and they were kind of proud of that. And he had the snipers up on the roofs as well. And this was an individual who had waxed poetic in the Wall Street Journal about how if the demographics of New Orleans don't change, then we're out, meaning the business is out. And he's the guy flying in Israeli paramilitaries to guard his property. When the fires happened in California, poor people were left to depend on a struggling fire force that was fighting like hell to put out those fires, and rich people called up private forces to come in and put out their fires. This is a metaphor for so much of what is happening in this country today. And if we think that New Orleans was just some horrible stain in the recent history of the United States, and I think a lot of people from various walks of life are horrified at what happened in New Orleans, but if you think that's not going to happen or isn't happening in poor and working class communities on some level or another every single day in this society, then you need to get out more. You need to talk more to people who are on the front lines of a struggle that they didn't invite on themselves. And so I want to leave room for discussion here, but I want to close by saying two things. One is that I would encourage every person in this room tonight on the issue of the Iraq War to log on to the Iraq Veterans Against the War website, ivaw.org. Or you can log on to democracynow.org, Amy Goodman's show, because she broadcast much of the Winter Soldier hearings. And just look a little bit, if you have time, into what took place, if you weren't aware of it before. If you're a member of MoveOn.org, write to MoveOn.org and say, we want you to publicize the Iraq Veterans Against the War Winter Soldier hearings to your listserv. If you're a supporter of Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, I would ask you to write them a polite letter or call them and encourage those campaigns to take an actual stand against the occupation of Iraq and call for all US troops and contractors to leave that country. And the last thing I'll say is this. I feel very humbled to be with all of you tonight and to be back here in my home city because we're honoring the life of Frank Zeidler. Milwaukee is a city that's had great public institutions, public media, public schools, public parks. Frank Zeidler was a tremendous part of defending those institutions and building them in this city, but he also was attached to a much bigger picture. In fact, he was the embodiment of the think globally, act locally way of approaching life. This was a man who was very engaged in the politics of international affairs, the politics of this nation, but his primary struggle, where he rolled up his sleeves and he worked hard every day of his life, was in defending the word public in all of the institutions of this city. That is our work as well, to defend public space, public thinking, public media, public schools, public participation. We need to reject this attempt, this effort, this radical campaign to privatize every component of our life, from the war machine right down to the schools in our community. And I think it's important that we educate young people in this city about the life and the legacy of Frank Zeidler and unite what we learn from Frank Zeidler and his life and his legacy with what we learn from those brave young men and women who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan and are saying no to this war. Big wars, little wars, it's all the same struggle. Thank you very much for being here.
Welcome home, Jeremy. Welcome home, Jeremy. Am I getting through?
I think I'm not exactly clear on how this part of it is going to go.
We need questions.
I'm open to anything.
This doesn't seem to be working.
Well, go ahead.
There we go. Am I coming through?
No.
No? I'll come here. We need, would you please give question cards to the ushers and bring them up, and we will proceed. But I wanted to say welcome home, Jeremy. Frank Zeidler would be delighted. Merrill Park should be proud. Thank you. I think this is more than a peace rally. This is a revival session, a public interest revival session. And we appreciate very much. Since I don't have it, why don't I start with a question? Blackwater got its first government contracts under the Clinton administration, and Senator McCain probably is going to do more of the same. So would you say that the hope lies in the new Congress and possibly Barack Obama, if he gets enough pressure, that maybe we can have a restoration or a removal of this privatization process, or at least a stopping, a return to what has made our country progressive?
Well, I'll answer this as briefly as I can. Barack Obama, because you brought up his name specifically, I mean, I think John McCain wants to keep U.S. troops in Iraq until they're all as old as he is, but I think that Barack Obama, he has a complicated position on this, because Obama actually was quite ahead of the curve among members of the U.S. Congress on the issue of private contractors, as they're called, in Iraq. In February of 2007, he introduced legislation that sought to apply U.S. civilian law to contractors operating abroad and to expand it to ensure that it applied to contractors like Blackwater who work for the State Department, not just those who work for the Pentagon. That bill has now become the Democrats' major approach on this issue. But the painful reality about Senator Obama's position on this issue is the following. If Barack Obama intends to keep this large army of so-called diplomats in Iraq, which he says he will, operating in the Green Zone and the monstrous U.S. Embassy, he would need to do one of three things. He would need to keep the current system in place, which is that he would have to have Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and DynCorp, these companies protecting his diplomats in Iraq, or he could make it a U.S. military operation and transfer all of that work over to the U.S. military, or he could rely exclusively on the State Department's Diplomatic Security Division. Now, here's the problem with that. And as I'm saying this, remember, if his policy was one of total withdrawal, we wouldn't be having this conversation, but it's not. If he wants to use the Diplomatic Security Agency of the State Department, I don't know where he's going to get the forces. Blackwater has 2/3 as many operatives in Iraq alone as the State Department has in every country in the world combined. That's how deeply embedded these guys have become. The State Department said it would take 2 to 3 years to hire enough forces to meet the levels currently in Iraq under Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and DynCorp. The U.S. military has said publicly it does not want to do that job in Iraq and that it doesn't have the force to do it. Furthermore, that would mean more U.S. soldiers coming into potentially lethal conflict with Iraqi civilians. And so the third option is to continue the current contracting arrangement, which Obama's people have told me they're going to be forced to do, but they say they want to try to get to a point where they reduce and ultimately eliminate the use of these companies. But this is unlikely to be done in a first term in office, and potentially even a second term in office if Obama continues on with that plan. So I think that's why it's very important to press on this issue. I don't know a lot about a lot of policy issues, but I've spent a lot of time studying this issue, and I don't think any of the viable candidates for president have what I would describe as a strong position on this issue, because I don't think any of them have a strong position on Iraq in general. And I think that that's an issue that should be raised within their campaigns by people who so enthusiastically support them. They need to listen to you. And if they don't, I think it speaks volumes to the nature of their candidacy.
Considering John McCain's, it's still not going. Considering John McCain's recent mix-up of Sunnis and Shiites, claiming the Iranians and Al-Qaeda are in cahoots, as well as the number of permanent bases and a large embassy in the world, largest embassy in the world being built in Iraq, what do you feel are the chances of the current administration seriously considering a preeminent attack on Iran? And there was another question of the same thing. Chances of an attack on Iran.
Well, I think it was, I found it very, very disturbing that Hillary Clinton supported the designation of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran as a terrorist organization. I think ultimately that plays into this heavily ratcheted up rhetoric emanating from the White House. I am very disturbed with Barack Obama's statements on Pakistan because it sounds to me very much like what we hear from Dick Cheney all the time about sovereignty or lack thereof of countries around the world and the perspective of the United States. I think that if the United States were to attack Iran, first of all, it would be a categorical disaster for the United States military. The Iranians have a very different makeup to their military than the Iraqis had. I think that it would be met with much fiercer resistance if they tried to go in on the ground. I think it's more likely that if we see any military action taken against Iran, it would come in the form of either Israeli airstrikes on facilities that the Israelis would accuse the Iranians of having developed for nuclear purposes. The Israeli military certainly had no problem bombing Iraq in the 1980s under the same rationale, or that the United States could engage in some kind of an air attack against Iran. But I have no way, of course, of knowing whether or not that's likely to happen. I'm not going to venture a guess. I will say that I think it would be a categorical disaster if the U.S. did attack Iran. I think it would have far-reaching consequences, and I think a tremendous number of Americans would die over the next 10 years as a result of such an offensive action. I think we would see potentially attacks here in the United States, the likes of which we really haven't seen. I think we could see attacks on public transportation systems. I think we have no idea the war that's going to come to this country. I mean, we've been living in a fairy tale land. The policies of this administration are going to have tremendous blowback, tremendous blowback. Our lives and the lives of our children are going to be very different than the lives of a lot of people who have lived 60 or 70 years in this country. We're going to be living in a very different country in 20 years. We live in a different one now.
Can we realistically expect any leader to have the courage to end the occupation? And what happens to Iraq when U.S. troops leave? Afghanistan?
I don't think any U.S. leader has the, I don't even think it's a matter of courage to end the Iraq War. I don't think that, you can go back and Professor Michael Schwartz and others have lectured about this and written about it extensively over the past year. Both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama talk about U.S. interests being involved with the U.S. maintaining a U.S. military presence inside of Iraq. It's not about courage. They share a common perspective with the Bush administration that the United States has some kind of a role to play militarily in Iraq. I completely disagree with that. I don't think it's a matter of courage. I think it's a matter of they don't share the opinion of the vast majority of their supporters. I think that they support U.S. military presence in that region. I think they support a U.S. domination of that region, both Obama and Hillary Clinton. I mean, Barack Obama says he's going to pull troops out of Iraq and send them immediately into Afghanistan. He wants to increase the U.S. Active duty troop deployment in Afghanistan by 9,000 soldiers quite quickly. He wants to expand the size of the U.S. military by 90,000 forces. Those are President Bush's numbers. So this isn't about courage. These guys are ultimately on the same, they're on the same team when it comes to the project of U.S. empire. On the issue of what happens to Iraq when U.S. troops leave, I don't think U.S. troops are going to be leaving Iraq in the next 4 years, except for the combat brigades that Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton pull out. The U.S. is going to maintain a sizable presence there. Yes, they're going to be in Afghanistan. If I had to make a prediction right now about Afghanistan, I would say that would become the hot war of whatever Democrat would win the White House, because if you're paying attention to what's happening in Afghanistan right now, the U.S. is in serious trouble. There's a growing resistance movement in that country. There are rebellions now breaking out in Iraq. I think we're about to hit another very, very bloody period for the U.S. in both of those countries.
Dr. Sami Al-Arian has been on a hunger strike since March 3rd. How can we put trust in a government when we see such abuses?
I think the case of Dr. Sami Al-Arian has been one of the greatest travesties of justice in this country when it comes to the so-called war on terror. This was a university professor at the University of South Florida of computer engineering who was, the Bush administration attempted to try him on 19 counts of terror-related charges, and they failed to secure a conviction. And so Dr. Sami Al-Arian went through a government trial where they spent over $60 million attempting to prosecute him. He actually was a supporter of President Bush in the 2000 election. Ironically enough, John Ashcroft announced his indictment, I believe, on either Jay Leno or David Letterman show instead of at a press conference in Washington. And Dr. Sami Al-Arian, because his family was being basically tortured by this ordeal and smeared and maligned in the press, ultimately told the government that he would plead guilty to one count of providing material support to a designated organization in return for the following: that he would leave the United States, even though he's a legal permanent resident, and that no further charges would be brought against him. The government then quickly moved in and they tried to force Sami Al-Arian to testify in an unrelated grand jury investigation. He refused to do so, and they've been holding him in prison now, I think, for the better part of 5 years. And he has gone on and off hunger strikes. And I believe there's going to be a showing of a documentary about him here in Milwaukee next week. On what night? On April 12th, and you can get information from Art Heitzer about it. I will say that Dr. Sami Al-Arian's daughter, Layla Al-Arian, is a colleague of mine She wrote an excellent article for The Nation magazine about the Winter Soldier hearings and has a book coming out with Chris Hedges in which they've interviewed over 60 U.S. soldiers about their experiences in Iraq.
Isn't it illegal to train paramilitary forces in the U.S.? How can Blackwater do it? And is there any way to reback the Blackwater contract?
Is it illegal to train paramilitary forces in the U.S.? Well, Blackwater's biggest client is the U.S. government. Over 90% of Blackwater's business is done with the U.S. Government. I mean, they're almost an entirely subsidized organization. We can't subsidize schools anymore, but we can subsidize mercenary companies. They train between 25 and 50,000 U.S. soldiers, police officers, SWAT teams, sheriffs. Every year they have a new camp on the Illinois-Wisconsin-Iowa border. They call it Blackwater North. Is it illegal? Well, I think there's an interesting question here. You know, we have the Anti-Pinkerton Act. You know, the so-called Pinkerton Detective Agency, or the Pinkerton Boys, were used to break up strikes, and they were a thug squad. And there is legislation that says that the U.S. can engage in contracts with paramilitary or quasi-paramilitary organizations. One of the lawsuits that's been brought against Blackwater for the killing of the Iraqis at Nicer Square says that Blackwater doesn't have a valid contract with the U.S. government because it violates the Anti-Pinkerton Act. Now, whether or not that's going to hold up in any kind of a court, I don't know. The Bush administration has been very clever in how they've classified these contractors over the years. So I don't think that there's going to be any real legal challenge to their corporate charter or their existence. Is there any way to reback the Blackwater contract? Absolutely. Congress could defund these operations in Iraq. The crowning achievement of Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid's Congress has been to win an approval rate lower than that of President Bush. That was their #1 achievement. And so I don't expect much to change on that front. I think this sort of Hail Mary logic that everything's going to change January 20th, 2009 is one of the most dangerous attitudes floating around out there right now. We know that the Bush administration is totally immune to anything the American people have to say that they don't agree with. They say so. We can't allow those people who purport to be for justice and against war to adopt that same attitude while smiling in the faces of their constituents who overwhelmingly are against the policies that they've been a part of for so many years.
Media questions. Why did MoveOn.org refuse to cover Winter Soldiers? And then you mentioned on Channel 4 News this morning that Obama and Clinton are not really going to end the Iraq War. Then why have the true, honest anti-war candidates like Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, and Mike Gravel been so marginalized by the mainstream media?
I think everybody knows the answers to these questions, but I'll take a shot at it. As for why did MoveOn.org refuse to cover Winter Soldier, I think you should all write them tomorrow morning and ask them why. John Stauber, who's a Wisconsin native, Center for Media and Democracy in Madison, has been on the rampage, on the warpath against MoveOn.org for this issue basically since Winter Soldier started, asking them in emails and phone calls and other communications to please just send out a simple email to your 3.3 million people and tell them to look at ivaw.org. And to my knowledge, MoveOn has not done that. Maybe they've somehow changed their policy tonight while we were here. I don't know, but I think it's certainly worth asking them. Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, Mike Gravel, I don't know how to give an answer that probably isn't already common sense to many of you in this room tonight. I mean, I think it was good that Ron Paul was in those Republican debates because the Republican debates are it's like watching a really disgusting fairy tale where not a moment of reality ever enters into it. And it was refreshing because you don't see that in the Republican debates, to actually see someone get up and say to John McCain and Mike Huckabee and Mitt Romney and all of these other robots, the war in Iraq has to come to an end, and it's U.S. policy that has caused so many of the problems. So that was refreshing. Dennis Kucinich, certainly one of the sharpest political minds in this country, and I have to say that I think it's important that Dennis Kucinich is in those debates. his opponents in the Democratic primary in Cleveland were sort of calling him the milk carton congressman, and they were going to put up missing posters for him and stuff. I think those attacks on Dennis Kucinich were unfair, and I'll tell you why. Dennis Kucinich is taken very seriously by other members of Congress in the Congress. He is not the man who he's portrayed to be on the campaign trail, the sort of joke, the little guy with the bad haircut who stands on the stage. Dennis Kucinich is actually a very serious legislator who takes on very serious issues in the Congress. He's been an aggressive and important member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee of Henry Waxman, and I think that Dennis Kucinich does a pretty damn good job of being a congressman in Washington. So whether he's mixing it up in the debates or he's there, Kucinich is one of the more serious social justice legislators we have in this country, and I think it's important that those voices were out there, and I think it's important that people continue to support independent politics in this country.
Frank Zeidler often predicted that the real agenda of the American right, in parentheses, Reich, is the destruction of our federal system. Do you agree? What do they plan to replace it with?
Well, do I agree that the agenda of the American right is the destruction of our federal system? I don't know that that's the exact phrasing that I would use. I think that the right is not against the use of federal tax dollars to continue to fund the U.S. military and the CIA and the FBI and forces of repression in this country. I think that the destruction of our federal system when it comes to any kind of a social services network, any kind of a safety net for vulnerable communities, any kind of an arrangement which would give working people or poor people in this country an opportunity to live a decent life with a fair wage and to be able to take care of their children, send them to schools that are not only reserved for the privileged or those lucky enough to have been born into wealth. Yes, I think that the agenda of the right is to destroy every possible component of the social net that we have in this country. And I think that that was reflected most vividly in the attempts by Mike Huckabee to abolish the IRS. Now, I would like to see the IRS not pay, what is it now, 70 cents of every tax dollar to the war machine. That certainly isn't the campaign that you hear the Republicans waging. They want the measly 30 cents that goes to other programs to be done away with. And so in that sense, yes, I do think that the agenda of some very powerful political forces in this country is to have a system of taxation that is primarily used to support the U.S. military and corporate interests, and to have no monies available for poor and working people, and to certainly not have health care that's affordable or education that's affordable. They need cheap labor.
A couple of local questions. Could you comment on the privatization of our alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Madison? Or it appears that the county executive is planning a management firm to privatize the Mitchell Airport, which will be in for a big renovation. You care to comment on county and state privatization process?
I don't know enough about it, unfortunately, and I don't want to speak about something that I don't know enough about. I think that I did follow, in a way, the situation that was happening with Midwest Airlines, and I was really disturbed at a lot of what was happening with the attempt to make Midwest Airlines a part of AirTran, and there was I think that in all, you know what, I'll say this in general, that I think that the public school system in this state was a great institution. I remember when I left high school and spent a brief bit of time at the university, I think that for a semester of tuition at the University of Wisconsin, and my dad is here somewhere, and I think it was around $1,200 or $1,400 a semester. And I'm not sure what it is now. But I think it's more, and I think they're also gutting financial aid, and they're forcing students into these loans with incredible interest rates, and then they're going to ruin your credit and mess up your efforts to start your adult life. I don't know what you exactly mean by the privatization of the University of Wisconsin system. I'm not saying anything about the accuracy of it. I'm just not aware of exactly what you mean by it. But I think in this state alone, we've seen a dramatic escalation in the cost of education. And this is all part of that bigger picture that we've been talking about. I mean, there's also a tremendous right-wing backlash on the campuses across this country, and I certainly see it traveling around, where right-wing forces on these campuses are taking over student governments, they're taking over student media, and they're using it as a vehicle to bring in very right-wing, pro-war forces to the campus, and they're trying to wipe out the social net on the campuses, too, for students who are of a disadvantaged economic status or are working students. Wisconsin had laws on the books when I was here that made it very difficult if you were a recipient of any kind of so-called welfare to at the same time get student aid, because your welfare required you to go and work, and if you worked then you were ineligible for student aid. And that was Tommy Thompson's genius invention, and it got nationalized in a lot of ways. And so we punish people who are actually trying to go out there and work minimum wage jobs to get some kind of benefits, and then we make it impossible for them to get financial aid because they had the audacity to go out and work in order to get their measly so-called welfare payments.
Specific one about Iraq. Do you know anything about the loss of the seed bank in Iraq during the initial invasion? And then can you speak to the role that Blackwater is playing in training law enforcement?
I don't know anything about the seed bank in Iraq. As for the role Blackwater is playing in law enforcement, in training law enforcement, Blackwater is one of the premier trainers of federal, state, local law enforcement. They've trained scores of sheriff's departments, SWAT teams, Navy SEALs, soldiers up and down the ladder of the military machine, 25 to 50,000 a year. That's their most consistent and robust business, and that's going to be there for the foreseeable future. Blackwater is sort of like I call them the Maserati of the industry. You know, they're like a high-end boutique on a strip full of Walmarts. They're not the biggest, they're not the most profitable, but they're considered to be the elite, and they're going to be around for a very, very long time, unless we somehow tomorrow magically have a very different Congress and a different program of the leading candidates for president. These guys' future, unfortunately, is quite secure.
Okay. Our last question. Given the fact that Americans are reelected, Americans reelected George Bush and are about 50-50 divided for or against the status quo, you think it's already too late to stop the privatization movement? Is there any hope?
Look, if I didn't believe there was hope, I wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't have come here in honor of Frank Zeidler. Of course, there's hope. There's hope because of people like you in this room. There's hope because of George and Julie, who were just out protesting for the 4,000th time. There's hope because of the people who have existed in the shadows and have marched in the streets and have raised their voices. And there's hope because I do believe that people are going to push right now. I think there's hope that so many people are engaged, and so many people that have never voted before are coming out for the first time in their lives are saying, I believe in something. And that's why I think it's important for us not to cynically say to those people, oh, well, you're just a part of the problem. No, keep the door open. Just like we learned from the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who are speaking out now, I heard their stories, and some of them said, you know, I just met 2 weeks ago somebody who confirmed for me that I'm not crazy in thinking that what we did over in Iraq was wrong. And if we don't take our struggle seriously enough to say we're going to keep the door open to those who may not see this the exact same way that we do, then we're not really about changing things. I'm not going to back Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. A lot of my friends are backing one of those people. And so I think what we do right now, what's most urgent, is we find that common ground that we have. And on the war, I think it is this. Most of the people supporting them want this war to come to an end. Most of us who operate in independent politics or are journalists or are engaged in grassroots action want the same thing. Let's all get together and push like hell to get them to take a better position while they still have to listen to us. That gives me hope, because I believe people will do this. I believe people want They want their candidate to actually be the person that they say they are. And I think we can't cast that aside and act as though they're not radical enough for us, and so we better just ignore them. No, no, no. Push, push, push. And I think that's a good way to end the night. Let's keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I think we're going to see a lot more of Jeremy ahead. Virginia has some instructions.
You think, with all your diplomatic bullshit, that you can appease Islamic fascists who are as nuts as Hitler? You want to know what I see, Mr. President? I see a world where in about 25 years, America's reserves are gone. Done. Demand is up 30–40%. And we have 2 oceans blocking us from the world reserves. You think we're gonna have allies then? We're at 5% of the world's population. We use 25% of its energy. You think Russia and China are gonna help us out when they need those resources themselves? 80% of the world's future energy reserves are right here in Eurasia, where the prize ultimately lies. Oil, gas, water. Iraq alone, 10% of the world's reserves. 60 of 80 oil fields are still undeveloped.
And probably another 100 billion gallons in their western desert. They're floating in a sea of oil.
We have bases in more than 120 countries all over the world. We include Iraq, look what happens. We are at the fertile choke point of civilization. The Tigris-Euphrates, the biblical cradle. We drain the swamp, like Don says. We rebuild it. We develop its resources to the maximum.
They own it, we run it. Pipelines, sea lanes, their resources finance the reconstruction.
Nexus of power that won't be broken in our lifetime, if we stick to the plan.
So what is our real exit strategy on Iraq, Dick?
There is no exit. We stay